Hello and welcome to this webinar organized by EsadeGeo, Esade's Center for Geopolitics and Business at Esade Business School, and together with our Fundación Repsol, with whom we are working with for a long time on issues of industry, climate change, and energy transition. So today's webinar is focused on the reindustrialization alongside decarbonization in the EU. And for this, we have a stellar set of speakers. First, however, let me tell you who am I. I'm Angel Saz Carranza, Professor of Strategy and Policy here at the EsadeGeo Business School, and I am also the Director of EsadeGeo, the Center on Geopolitics and Business. I also want to share with you that we have, in this ongoing partnership with Fundación Repsol, we are producing policy briefs on matters of interest and the matters that we cover in this collaboration. And we have just produced a new policy brief under the title "The Effects of the IRA in Europe," which tries to start painting and pointing at where the EU should be going in terms of policy to respond or simply to coexist with the IRA in this new world full of industrial policy with far less respect for international trade laws, and obviously all of us trying to manage and lead the energy transition. So in this policy brief, we essentially point out three things. One is that we expect the new commission to focus on the competitiveness side of the energy transition after a full term of energy transition policies. We also call for a further integration of our electricity market beyond what is being done today. We need much more integration in terms of transportation, distribution, and market integration at the generation point. And finally, the other element we are very interested in and we really want to underscore is that the response has to come from Europe to the IRA. Industrial policy has to be executed, designed at the EU level, and we really cannot afford to fragment the single market in our policies, in particular in our policies in response to the IRA and other industrial policies happening out there in the world, which affect us Europeans in different ways. Now, to discuss the issue of industrialization and decarbonization, we have a stellar set of guests today here with us. We have first Mr. Stefan Vergote, who is a senior advisor at DG Clima. He has a very long experience at the Directorate General for Clima in the EU. But also at different DGs in the European Commission, among them DG Energy in the past, where he has worked. And his background is an engineer turned into policymaker, and his schooling is at the KU Leuven. Welcome, Stefan Vergote.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you for introducing me, but you want to introduce also the other speakers, I presume.
Yes, thanks, Stefan. So next we'll have Raquel Carretero, who is a senior analyst for regulatory affairs at Repsol. She will be speaking and giving us the perspective from a corporate angle. She has extensive background in public policy, in particular also from a media and communications perspective. She has been a journalist in the past and has been in charge of digital public policy at Telefónica prior to her position at Repsol. Thank you, Raquel.
Thank you so much for having me today. Although the person who was expected to be here today is Anna Alvarez, who is frankly brilliant. She's the head of the European Public Affairs and Brussels office, and due to personal matters, she has not been able to attend this webinar. And I will do my best to share Repsol's vision in this matter. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, Ana Alvarez unfortunately had to drop out for personal reasons. Thank you, Raquel, for being with us. And finally, Dr. Martin Porter. He is the executive chair of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. He has a very long experience in public affairs and policy making. He, in particular, in terms of environmental issues, and where he still works in getting involved in policy making, proposing policy making and policies around environmental issues. Thank you, Martin, for being with us.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to be with you, and good to see one familiar face in Stefan and a new face in Raquel, and I look forward to it very much. So thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. So the structure today will be, we're going to give the floor first to Stefan, who will give us a view from the Commission of what are the policies and actions coming out from the Commission in terms of reindustrialization and decarbonization. We will then have Raquel give us a corporate point of view, and finally Martin. Now, we will also be have plenty of time for Q&A, and for that, I ask all of you to propose your questions in the comments section of your wherever you're viewing us, and we'll make sure to collect them and place them to the speaker. So without further ado, Stefan, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angel, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on this actually quite fascinating topic. Very good moment in time, I think, to discuss this. On the one hand, the Commission has come out only recently, last month, with its communication on the 2040 target, a communication on industrial carbon management, and also it's a timing before the elections and before the new Commission coming in. So, well, and no doubt within the context of the new Commission, this topic will be very much at the forefront of the discussions and the thinking of the mandate of the next Commission. To introduce the topic, I would like to make a few introductory comments. A first point I would like to make in this context on industrial decarbonization and how we can promote decarbonizing industry and industrial growth in Europe is the point that in the last couple of years we have gone with the Green Deal through to a process of strengthening the regulatory framework. And when we think about industrial decarbonization, this is extremely important in the sense that not only the policy framework of the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 sets the direction, but it also sets the rules and the incentives that industry will receive and the price signals that industry will receive to decarbonize and to take the right action. And that regulatory framework is decided actually in quite a swift approach. And despite all the difficulties with COVID, and then later on with the crisis of Ukraine and the gas crisis, which actually have, to a certain extent, first it created some doubts about the possibility of the Green Deal going forward, but actually it created unity in the European Union and between the member states and the European Parliament, because it was clearer than ever that we cannot continue to rely heavily on imported fossil fuels, and that we needed to take action, that there was a common sense of direction, both in terms of our economic prerogatives and the prerogatives coming from climate change. So that regulatory framework is extremely important and will hence needs to be stable. And now, and that is basically my second point that I would like to make, now we need to move on, and that should be our first priority in the next years, is we need to move towards implementation, towards investment. And the area that I would like to particularly highlight as being crucial is indeed the area of the power markets and the increase of renewable energy, renewable power in the power markets. because that is, of course, a question of market integration. But it also means that basically the policy drivers from an energy security perspective, from an affordability of power perspective, and from the perspective of climate change, all these policy drivers are now pointing in the same direction. So we can accelerate and we should accelerate. If we look at our analysis, we are today at 44% renewables. We should move quite quickly by 2030 towards 65+ share of renewable power in the electricity mix. And that comes with its own challenges in terms of implementation, meaning we need to get it right in terms of permitting, because the acceleration of the deployment is considerable, a factor 2 to 3 compared to what it was 2-3 years ago. We need to think about the necessary and work on the necessary infrastructure, the transmission lines, the distribution network, and to make that fit for purpose. And that is also a big investment challenge that is coming. And we need to work on the flexibility, and for that in particular, we need to work further on market integration, cross-border infrastructure, etc., and energy, things like energy storage. So all that together, I think we can have the tools to make electricity both decarbonized quite fast, as well as doing that at competitive prices and being less dependent on gas being on the margin in the power market, and hence determining the high price. A third point that I would like to make is indeed about the green industrial policy, because with the regulatory framework and with the implementation, one could think that basically the tools are in place for the private sector to invest. But what we have seen indeed in the last years is increasing trade tensions, strong industrial policies, both in China and in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act. So the level playing field in terms of who is going to the winning players in those markets, who that will be, has been shifting. A couple of years ago, I would say that in a number of clean tech areas, Europe was doing quite well, for instance, like wind. But also the battery sector was investing heavily in 2020, 2021 in Europe. But that has also been changing, for instance, due to the IRA. So that is an important area to think about. The clean tech manufacturing sector will grow very rapidly in the next 5 to 10 years. The IEA is predicting $600 billion, a market of $600 billion per year in 2030. And in terms of industrial decarbonization, we have a number of hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, chemicals, where it might still be difficult to invest on the basis of current CO2 prices, despite CBAM and despite having a reasonable carbon price in the EU market, that it may be necessary to have more support there as well. And we have started with the first instruments under the Green Industrial Plan, like the Net Zero Industry Act. And that is, I think, an interesting starting point, also in the context of seeing how that will develop. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, what people think about it. But what is clear, of course, is that in the discussions on NZIA, the trade-offs that industrial policy is faced with in terms of, for instance, being open to trade on the one hand, on the other hand, taking into account sustainability and resilience criteria in, for instance, public procurement or in renewable auctions, that is a trade-off that needs to be tackled. It is good, for instance, to try and have more of the value chain in Europe, but that can also come with a price. A similar issue is the TCTF, the state aid framework that has been revised and has been made more flexible, which has been very important as a response to the Inflation Reduction Act, in particular in the field of clean tech manufacturing. But at the same time, there are concerns about in how far that leads to a situation that investments in certain member states in clean tech can be more facilitated than in others. And a third point I would like to make in this context also of NZIA is the importance of carbon capture and storage, where the Net Zero Industry Act has come forward with an obligation for oil and gas producers to invest in CO2 storage capacity in the EU, because we see this is really a missing piece in the infrastructure that we need in terms of the mitigation pathway of CCS to store carbon underground in geological formations. A final point I would like to make relates perhaps a bit more forward-looking, based on the developments that we are seeing today on the green industrial policy, and that relates to the fact that if we are a bit more looking forward, that it will probably be important to think about a green industrial policy that has a stronger European pillar, or at least a stronger coordination at European level. And there are good reasons for that. I think because in terms of the competition between different economic blocks, scale is important, and economies of scale are important. Secondly, the correct allocation of resources and the efficient allocation of resources is relevant. If it is, for instance, cheaper to have solar in Spain and to produce renewable hydrogen with cheaper renewable electricity in Spain, that is a useful asset that we need to use, and that can be helped through using European instruments. And we need to build on the internal markets and try to avoid a subsidy race, of course, between the member states when it's about state aid. And I do think overall that we have a number of important instruments at EU level to do that. We have, of course, Horizon Europe. In terms of infrastructure, we have the Connecting Europe facility. That is particularly important for cross-border infrastructure relating to CO2 transport, or relating to hydrogen, or relating to electricity networks. We have the Innovation Fund, and we have InvestEU, which is a bit the financial arm that can help the EIB and promotional banks to leverage private capital. And these instruments actually have a number of common features, that they work directly actually with the private sector. And I think that's an important feature, because it helps a bottom-up approach to help projects that are selected by the companies themselves. And we actually see in all those instruments that we have at European level that they are heavily oversubscribed. And in that sense, what the proposal from the Commission tried to do with the Strategic Technologies for Europe plan to strengthen, in particular, those instruments, was actually a very modest but helpful step in the right direction. Unfortunately, I would say, in the context of the co-decision process, member states did not really support the strengthening of those funds in the final compromise. A final point: we need to think about how to pool resources, and that can be by bringing resources at the European level. It can also be by pooling national money. And a particular example I would like to give in the context of the Innovation Fund is that we have currently organized our first European renewable auction for renewable hydrogen. So within the Innovation Fund, we had foreseen 800 million for an auction to give a green premium for the production of renewable hydrogen. But what we also allowed and actually facilitated through a state aid approval was that member states could have their own auctioning window within that platform, within that auction platform. And for instance, Germany has committed 350 million to actually, in addition to the European auction, have an auction to have the cheapest projects within Germany also supported through national German money. And that, I think, is an example of how we can try to reduce red tape, bring selection at European level, but also pool resources of national and European level. IPCIs is perhaps another example, but just to say that in terms of the thinking, it seems important on how we can also work together and coordinate efforts at European level, also by pooling resources. I'll leave it at that, but very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Stefan. A lot of information there on broad approaches to the industrialization under the decarbonization movement, and quite some information also regarding instruments that we might want to discuss. Raquel, why don't you give us the perspective from a major European energy player?
Yeah, of course. And let me start by saying that the global economy is entering a year full of potential and geopolitical uncertainties that may have a considerable impact on industrial, environmental, and economic policies. And on top of war conflicts, key elections in much of the world, including the United States and the European Union, may result this year in a world that is more polarized, less globalized, and we could even see more protectionist policies. So bearing this in mind and looking at the European Union and our sustainability goals, it is worth asking what role the private sector can play in accelerating decarbonization and driving the reindustrialization of our region. And the energy sector has never been immune to these geopolitical tensions and changes. And at this time, we must remain committed to the European Union's decarbonization goals, while at the same time, we need to improve energy security and maintaining competitive energy prices for the industry to be affordable not only for the industry but also for citizens. So here, as an industry, we have a great challenge, but also as an economy and society. And that is why I would like to focus my words on the perspective of the energy industry, and the energy producer, and on a new value chain that will transform our industry and economy if the right conditions are put in place. And we are referring to one of the most resilient pillars of the economy in times of crisis, and that can boost the autonomy of the European economy, as we have seen with the Ukraine-Russia conflict and its consequences. So the importance of this sector lies in our great capacity to drive technological and innovation, technological development and innovation to generate stable and quality employment, and for its pulling effect on the rest of the productive sector. And just to have this figure in mind, the European industry is the backbone of our economy, and it directly provides 35 million jobs across Europe. But the harsh reality is that Europe's share of the world industrial value has declined by 11% compared to 1995 data. This is not the best scenario for the European Union when the message is clear. Industrial competitiveness and opportunities for the progress of the European economy and society are like two sides of the same coin. And this data comes at a key moment for the energy transition, where the European Union is a benchmark in the ambition to fight climate change, with regulations such as the Fit for 55 package or the Green Deal Industrial Plan that Mr. Begoto was referring before. And in this case, European industry also plays a key role to meet climate neutrality by 2050, and also the recently communicated 2040 targets. And for example, the energy transition involves large investments, estimated annually at 522 billion euros for green targets. And although private funds will account for the majority of these investments in the energy transition, we need also public intervention to reduce the risk of innovative projects and also to overcome market failures. Then public support at national and EU level should be well aimed at attracting private investment. And this implies at least stability and consistency in regulation, and coherence also in financing and support frameworks for developing decarbonization technologies and projects. And easier and harmonized principles, I would say, are crucial to avoid fragmentation of the single market. The penalization also of specific technologies, solutions, or projects, and also to avoid the demonization of economic sectors that could contribute to this decarbonization. And this is especially important when many regions, as said before, of the world are committing significant amounts of funds, and they are implementing policy and fiscal measures to accelerate the green transition, while ensuring also investment and industry retention, as in the case of the US with the IRA or China. More than ever, Here, the commitment to advance the energy transition in a sustainable and affordable way should not only aim at reducing the carbon footprint, but I think also at finding the means to achieve it by counting on the industry as, I would say, as a natural ally and a lever for change. And it means that we need to accompany the Green Deal with an industrial deal to turn intentions and proposals into goals and policies that will drive European reindustrialization and decarbonization. And this paradigm should be developed also as part of the future reports that Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi are going to write on the European single market and competitiveness. The thing here is that if we don't react in time, Europe will reduce emissions and industry at the cost of others increasing them. And we could consider different options, such as eliminating the industry or leaving the industry to a minimum. But if the production is not here, it will be somewhere else, in China, in India, or in other places that are much less demanding in terms of decarbonization policies. So by transferring European industry to other places with laxer climate policies, which is now happening, we are obviously exporting emissions and losing industrial weight. And by losing industry, we are losing competitiveness and jobs. So for this reason, we think that the EU should boost fair competition among technologies, promoting research, development, innovation, and because it is also already in the basis of the current proposals, such as the Net Zero Industry Act. We can talk about different decarbonized technologies, renewable fuels, hydrogen, carbon capture, use and storage, because they are valuable solutions for the decarbonization of industry and also for sustainable and decarbonized mobility. And I'm thinking about renewable fuels that can be used to decarbonize the existing vehicle fleet, including road transport, maritime, aviation, because in an increasingly changing geopolitical context, as I was saying at the beginning, where supply chains could be disrupted, these solutions could help to address the situation and be crucial for both the decarbonization of the industry and mobility, and also to securing energy supply in Europe. And it is essential to add decarbonization solutions to go faster and at a lower energy cost for industries and citizens. And here, well, renewable electricity will be and already is the first driver of decarbonization in the energy sector, but it will take time, and it will not be able to reach all applications or cover the needs of all citizens and ways of transport. And the transport sector is precisely one of these difficult cases of decarbonization, in which we will to add solutions combining such as electrons and also renewable molecules. And it is a new value chain of renewable molecules, which is much talked about, but very little integrated. And it has the capacity to transform and revolutionize the industry. For all this reason, and in the case of the private sector, we want to contribute to the decarbonization decisively, and as we push to accelerate the energy transition. We have the experience, we have the willingness and the means to do so, but what we need is a more inclusive, more choice-agnostic regulatory framework within this value change. And here regulation could serve as an accelerator of European competitiveness and energy transition, while I would say allowing us to compete on global scale.
Great. Thank you, Raquel, for this perspective from an industrial player in the EU. So let's move on to Martin, who will give us a perspective from a think tank player.
Thank you, Angel. And I'll try and pick up on what each of you have, in your different ways, said. And I think one of the most important aspects to this is actually to think about how we are able to co-develop, essentially, the types of response that we now need that involve, obviously, the private sector and policymakers, but also parties that are associated, whether they are workers, think tanks, NGOs and others, because the notion of a deal, which Raquel mentioned, I think is only going to succeed if it's inclusive. And again, those are notions that she referenced, and I think will be key to political success of any industrial deal that complements the European Green Deal. But let me step back in order to try to address the question of what now we should be thinking about and trying to undertake, because I think you mentioned in your introduction how the world has changed essentially, and we're facing a situation that has changed dramatically from 5 years ago when the European Green Deal was proposed, and it has shown its resilience, I guess, to COVID, Ukraine. You mentioned economic challenges now, and I think, as Stefan and others mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, even greater competition from China. I mean, it's a new world in many ways, and that I think is very important to recognize, but also to set alongside the fact that the climate crisis is as urgent, if not more so than ever as well. So we have to deal with all of these together, rather than assume that the Green Deal was the last 5 years and we now need something that is putting much more emphasis on competitiveness and security and resilience, but somehow moves on from the Green Deal. I think it's the basis for much of what has been achieved and still needs to be achieved, and has proven proven to be quite successful in many ways. So with that, let me just think about what the underlying strategy of the Green Deal was, because I guess that's worth double checking before we then think about what needs to change and be done better, because quite obviously there is a greater emphasis on competitiveness, the role of industry in Europe in this as we look at the current situation. But the underlying logic of the Green Deal, even if we focused a lot on setting the regulatory framework that Stefan mentioned and the rules of the single market in place, was that it was also a growth strategy. And that was a deliberate strategy that was based on the single market being the engine of market demand creation, and setting those rules in place would enable businesses in the private sector to plan ahead and to invest against those rules, and with hope, obviously, not only be able to achieve the sort of climate neutral industrial technology development that we need, but to develop those industries, those value chains in Europe as a platform to developing their businesses globally. And in many respects, that I think has proven successful. But as we also saw through the last couple of years in particular, what that strategy lacked was an industrial strategy running alongside it of equal significance and scale and ambition. And we've seen the beginnings of it in the Green Deal Industrial Plan, and as was mentioned, the Net Zero Industry Act and associated activities. But they are, and I'd be interested to see your paper on this, I think it would be hard to say they have yet proven their ability to match the scale of the challenge that we face in Europe. And that is essentially what we're now looking at, even if I think there are some comparisons with the US, for example, which suggest we haven't got as much funding available. In fact, I think the total funding available under EU schemes of one sort or another is not far off what the US has. It's just more difficult to get. It's disaggregated. There are many more sources of funding, and it takes longer to get to them. So that's a real challenge and problem for the private sector in accessing it. But on the other side, obviously, China's competitive challenges of a different order of magnitude, and maybe more focused on the extent to which it's playing by the rules of the game. I think you've mentioned already the challenge to trading and free trade in the current context is that more and more we're finding those WTO-based rules-based agreements are not being reflected. So the challenge for the EU is how to develop a resilient and fair response to that. Now, the underlying logic of this approach is one which I think the Commission captured well in a phrase and a concept it described as competitive sustainability. So how to make a success of this transition, this very dynamic process of reimagining the economy and our society in order to be climate neutral and sustainable in other ways, because it's linked obviously to resource consumption, biodiversity loss, and so on. And that strategy is what underpinned the European Green Deal, but also now needs to be revisited to take on this industrial challenge that we see facing us. And there are some elements which I think, as Raquel said, we need a paradigm shift in the way we think about these things that we haven't quite yet thought through completely, and which I think are worth addressing together in the context of any discussion about an industrial deal, because they will help us find the right paradigm to respond to now. So a few elements of that I think are important. One is that when we talk about industry, we have to make sure we're talking about the whole of the value chain that is relevant here. Clearly, there is a manufacturing, materials processing and manufacturing role, which is very important in the energy as well as other areas. But we have to take the whole value chain into account in Europe if we're going to get a full picture of what we need to consider when we're looking at the competitive base for our industries. And sometimes we aren't clear about that full value chain approach. Secondly, and there's work that we've done in CISL on this, when we're looking at competitiveness, we have to recognize that the definition and understanding of it is a little vague. It's not always referenced in the same way by the same organizations or different organizations. And actually, a lot of the attraction that investors have to the European Union is found in areas linked to its stability of governance, its rule of law, its transparency and plurality. And that governance framework is very important as a competitive advantage. To some extent, you can say the same thing about our social market economy, the extent to which we are able to invest behind better social outcomes. And obviously on the economic dimension, it's important to make sure that we're talking about how we're investing behind the sort of economic activities which deliver net zero and all of the areas that we know are going to be growing so much in the years to come, some of which you've mentioned. But those are the growth areas of the economy, in addition to their links to the digital AI revolution we're seeing as well. The question being, are we measuring and accounting for the right set of dynamics when we're developing an industrial strategy? And I think you mentioned at the beginning that we need an EU industrial strategy. I think that's absolutely right. If we look back at the last, not just 5 years, but beyond, we see a series of national strategies being aggregated, but not really a European strategy that we can say underpins them all. And therefore, if we continue doing that, we will lack the scale and the capacity to act at European level, which will enable us to really compete with the US and China, amongst others. And that's where the investment challenge comes into sort of immediate view again. The notion that we have to close the investment gap that we know exists for just the climate neutrality piece of this agenda is a big challenge. And some of that can be achieved through greater coordination that you mentioned and that Stefan mentioned. Some of it needs to be maybe thinking about a step change in the way that the EU acts collectively on that investment agenda. So pooling essentially more decision making and pooling more funding in order to develop the capacity to act on industrial investment issues in ways which take a genuinely European-wide perspective into account. And some of that will not be full European, it may be transnational, involving clusters and regions of Europe, which are best placed from an industrial perspective to build on the ecosystem that they have, involving their workforce, the industrial base that exists already, universities, and the innovation ecosystem that surrounds them. But that strategy we still haven't clearly articulated, and I think some of it is because we still don't have the right competitive sustainability-based analytics that we have to work with in doing that. And I think if we do that, then we will more clearly see where there will be winners, but also losers. And I think it's important to recognize that this change will involve disruption to the existing economy. Lots of opportunities, lots of growth areas that we know about, but geographically specific, community-specific problems that we need to address in those communities, and that the EU is well placed to do that through cohesion funds, regional policy, and so on. But also that some of the scale necessary will only be possible if countries work together through European level strategy and funding. So a deal of the sort that Raquel mentioned, I think, is absolutely essential and needs to be developed with the involvement of those regions, of those other interests and stakeholders, and needs to be at European as well as national and local levels, but certainly European level, precisely in order to be able to confront this new world and new set of challenges that we face rapidly. And I think the need for speed here is very clear. We can't afford to slow down on the transition to climate neutrality, but we've also got to be much clearer about where we need to take bolder decisions to protect some of the existing markets and productive capacity that we have, so that trade and investment is undertaken on a fair basis, that we de-risk in certain areas, and we've got underlying efforts that are working in that direction, which we haven't bottomed out yet, and are not applying fully, even through the NZIA in certain sectors. And to make sure this is a key part of the next 5-year agenda. I think, as you mentioned, Angel, in the beginning, the next 5 years are likely to be defined by an emphasis on competitiveness, security, defense, and so on, and very understandably so. But we cannot do that at the expense of the sustainability transition. And I think we have in the approach that we've developed so far, at least the building blocks to develop a world-leading strategy of competitive sustainability that does integrate those challenges together. If we're able to scale and collectively agree at European level how to approach this in ways which we haven't done before. So let me leave it at that for now, and then we can take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin, for your comments. So let's have, we've covered a lot of ground from 3 different speakers. Let's try to open it up for questions and perhaps drill into certain particularities. So one question I wanted to pose to the 3 of you is, we've all looked at the Inflation Reduction Act. Those of us here, that's been clearly a paradigm shift. I'm right now in the United States, and you can see it almost in action happening. What can we learn from the IRA from our different perspectives? Stefan, perhaps you could go first. You're muted. Sorry.
So yes, the Inflation Reduction Act has, of course, in a way been groundbreaking in different ways. I think what is very positive about it is that it was the first time that US did really a major action on climate change. There has been different analysis on what it means in terms of reductions in the US in 2030. People are talking about order of magnitude minus 40% for the economy as a whole. That's not yet on par with the pledge that US has made in the Paris Agreement, but it is a material difference of where they are today. So that's really an important element. I think in many ways, different aspects of the IRA are not that different of what we have been doing in Europe. I'm thinking in particular about what the IRA does for renewable energy and renewable power and how it subsidizes that. I'm sure that the numbers we are having in Europe are in terms of support and are similar to what is happening in the US. In terms of cars, I think in a way it also tries to accelerate electrification of transport. It does it in a different way. What is of course different is the local content rules in that regard. So that is where it gets a bit tricky. On industrial decarbonization, I'm not so sure if the US approach will be that successful when we talk about things like hydrogen or CCS, CCU. And in particular, I'm not sure if a subsidy approach for those long-lived investments that need to be there for 20, 30, 40 years can make it purely on the basis of subsidies and without a carbon price. What we see in the Innovation Fund is that in the Innovation Fund, we have to just pay for the extra gap because the mitigation cost is still a bit too high. But in the US, with a pure subsidy approach, you really need to compete with the subsidy compared to cheap gas. And if that subsidy disappears at some point in time, it does not really structurally change the investment picture. Where I think there is a big difference is the area of the advanced manufacturing tax credits. So the support for solar manufacturing, the support for battery manufacturing, the support for wind manufacturing, where the subsidies are extremely generous. And we have seen a big impact on the investment rates, certainly in terms of the announcements, but also in terms of projects taking ground. And that is, of course, a major difference with what we have been doing in Europe so far. So that is something we cannot, it's difficult to simply replicate. We have not a fiscal union to work with tax credits. In a way, the US did it with tax credit because it was impossible through regulation or through ETS. Perhaps for some it would have been, but because of the political situation in the US, that was basically the only way to get a majority. But on the other hand, it does have its consequences. So that is, I think, an area where we need to think about on how we can better formulate an answer to those issues.
Thank you, Stefan. Raquel.
Yeah, comparing the IRA and the European framework, and from the standpoint of a private investment in accelerating the energy transition, the truth is that the European regulatory framework is not easy to understand as we would like it to be. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Fit for 55 package, which comprises 13 legislative proposals with almost 4,000 pages, amending existing laws and introducing new ones. And in comparison, the IRA covers different topics, including healthcare or corporate taxes, and also energy-related legislation, condensed into 274 pages, if I'm not mistaken. So the numbers here are relevant. According to the US government, in the first 12 months since the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law, private sector has announced more than 110 billion in new clean energy manufacturing investment. And besides, investment have created more than 170,000 jobs. And the law is projected to create more than 1.5 million additional jobs over the next decade. So here in Europe, we are hopeful that under the Commission's Better Regulation program, the next political cycle could be an opportunity to work on a simple, easier to implement and an evidence-based regulatory approach, recognizing that regulation must serve as a lever to achieve climate and competitive goals. And this also implies involving citizens, private sector, businesses, and different stakeholders in the decision-making process, and also consistency in the development of the secondary regulation and implementation, as Mr. Fergote said before, and also acting collectively, as Mr. Porter also stated. Regulatory stability to create legal certainty is a must here to create an attractive framework for investment. And for now, a U.S. economy that benefits from the financial support from the IRA and a Chinese overcapacity and rising exports to Europe increase the pressure for the European industry even more. And meanwhile, the cost of the energy in Europe are simply too high to compete. So this is a call to action. Time is against the European Union to compete in these conditions if we want to avoid the relocation of the industry. And in order not to be just the regulatory referee between the US and China match, and to continue to participate as a relevant player on a global scale, we need a holistic industrial plan to raise competitiveness and as a strategic priority. And
Thanks.
this is the voice of the industry, yeah, because it was stated at the Antwerp Declaration a couple of weeks ago, that was supported by more than 700 Finns, and also by Ursula von der Leyen and Alexander De Croo, the Belgian Prime Minister themselves.
Thank you. Martin, what do you think about the IRA?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that the Inflation Reduction Act was not targeted at Europe, and we're better looking at it in the context of what China, as well as the US and others, are doing, rather than in isolation. And it sent a very strong message about how the US regarded China and didn't actually think too much about the impact on Europe when it was developing it. So there's lesson number one there. Lesson number two, I think, is that the EU nonetheless has prided itself on leadership on climate action. And actually what China and the US are showing us is that that is not a given, and that these areas of industrial development, these growth markets, are being pursued with real determination and speed by China and the US. And we had better wake up to that very quickly in Europe. So in that sense, it's a helpful kick to remind us that we've got to do even more than we have been doing. I think to Raquel's point, clearly the speed of access to the finance that's available there is higher than it is in Europe through the different funds that we have available in Europe, even if the total funds may not be that different in total. But that's very important from a private sector perspective. We need quick access to capital, and we have to make sure somehow that we improve on that. But I think, as Stefan said, they played to their strengths. They were able to act at federal level with this type of fiscal stimulus, which we do not have the capacity at the moment, and probably for the sort of short term at the very least, capability to do at EU level. So we quite rightly, I think, have built up our regulatory capacity here. And I don't think it's being caught in the middle between China and the US. This is a real market strength that the EU has had and continues to have, to be able to set global rules in a sense. Very often the template is set by regulatory experience in the EU that is globalized, not copycatted exactly. And if we can continue to do that, we can shape global markets and responses as well. Very often, therefore, the regulation is pro-competitive. We can have bad regulation, and we can be poor in the way that we expect some of the reporting obligations, for example. But often the absence of regulation is what hinders the development of certain markets and industrial technologies, not the over-regulation of it. So I think we need to be sort of nuanced as to where they've done well and badly from that point of view. And then I think lastly, where they did do a smart job was targeting the investment with a political perspective to communities in mind. And if you look at the administration and its color, the money and the funds have not gone always to the same political color states. Let's put it like that. That may be a very important lesson. We'll see how much that matters or plays in the election, obviously. But I think making sure you're thinking about the recipients and the local communities, essentially, is an important lesson there. Not to mention the fact that they call it the Inflation Reduction Act. And it therefore covers a wider range of issues than climate action or green investment. They clearly have understood that needed to be portrayed in a different way to what we're used to in Europe, at least. So I think there's a lot of lessons from this.
Thank you. So we're nearing the end of this webinar. We've covered a lot of ground. We've identified many elements that we need to work on, from market integration to investment attraction to stable regulation to mobilizing private sector capital. What would each one of you think if you were to choose one area to work on and prioritize? Which one would that be if we could advise the new commission in September? So what would you put at the top of your to-do list? And we've got many things there, but what would we try to think about? Perhaps Raquel, you can start off.
Well, I think it's a very complex question, but I think that competitiveness of the European Union is a must here. And there are some words that I could recover from interventions from Mr. Begote and Mr. Porter about the need to act collectively, in this case, to avoid fragmentation between member states, because I think we cannot allow the European Union to develop at two different speeds. And I'm talking about market structure and about financing, and also about coherence in regulation. So it is crucial to boost the development of all net zero technologies, as I said before, just to combine the climate ambitions and the industrial policy goals, or at least perhaps we should be thinking about new goals on our regulatory proposals to compete on a level playing field, as said at the beginning, I think, by Mr. Begote, with other regions, and that do not have the same climate ambition. That is what I would say.
Thank you. Martin.
I'm going to allow myself two answers rather than just a single one, but I think this is an investment agenda question. It's how to channel large-scale investment very rapidly towards the industries, the innovation that we know are going to be the crucial enablers of us succeeding in a new world economy. The growth markets and growth technologies are pretty clear. I think it was Stefan's boss in DG Climate who said we need a Juncker plan on steroids recently. So it's an investment agenda. I think that's absolutely right. How do we enable or facilitate that? The linked piece I would say that's important is to frame this all within the notion of competitive sustainability. We have to keep the linkage between the logic of the Green Deal and climate action that we've pursued so far, with the benefits that that's accrued, with this new focus on competitiveness. We have to keep those two things absolutely locked together, and they must not become separate agendas. I think we would be much stronger and more successful if we do that.
Thanks. Great. And Stefan, I know you're in the commission, but perhaps you can give us a more personal idea of your priorities.
I will also allow me to give two small points.
Sure.
A couple of weeks ago, I was with in a clean tech manufacturing dialogue organized by Vice President Šefčovič. And the message we got, I think, from almost every member in that dialogue was stay the course. And that was very interesting to see. And it's also perhaps a bit of a response to when people say investment in the US is so much better and secure. I think one asset that we have in Europe is that we have had consistency in policy. And we have, in the last 20, 25 years, we have stayed the course. And I think that's also for business that is extremely important. The second thing, very similar to Martin and Raquel, I think that investment agenda is crucial. It will be a commission of investment and implementation and competitiveness. And in a way, it has been quite a while, or perhaps we haven't had really industrial policy in Europe since a long time. So I think the contributions from think tanks, research institutes on how to shape that, and in particular in a constitution with 27 member states that not always have exactly the same industrial capacity, the same industrial structure, how to frame that, I think is extremely useful to think about now and to make contributions on.
Great. So thank you very much. I think that's a great note to end with. I want to reiterate that my thanks to all of you for making time to spend this 1 hour with us. And I think we've had a wonderful conversation. And to the audience, I hope to see you all soon in our future events, which will come in the next coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. Thank you.